I never thought a frozen puddle on my back steps would turn into a legal nightmare that would expose corruption, theft, and fraud in my homeowners association. But here we are. My name is Grant Henderson, and I've lived in Meadowbrook Estates in Columbus, Ohio for 3 years now. It's one of those cookie-cutter suburban developments where every house looks almost identical. The lawns are measured with rulers, and the HOA treats the neighborhood covenants like they're the 10 Commandments carved in stone. I'm a software engineer who works from home, single, 34 years old, and I mostly keep to myself. I bought this house because it was a good investment and close to my parents, not because I particularly cared about living in a community with strict rules about mailbox colors and holiday decoration timelines. The trouble started on a frigid Tuesday morning in late January. I was making coffee when I heard the doorbell ring. Through the frosted glass, I could see the unmistakable silhouette of someone holding a clipboard, which in my neighborhood only meant one thing: HOA business. I opened the door to find Brenda Carmichael, the HOA president, standing on my front porch with her usual expression of barely concealed disapproval. Brenda was 52 years old with helmet-like blonde hair, always wearing pantsuits that looked like they came straight from a 1980s office supply catalog. And she had the kind of personality that made you understand why people hate HOAs. "Good morning, Grant," she said in that tone that suggested it was anything but good. "I'm here to inform you that you've received a violation notice." I blinked at her, still half asleep. A violation for what? She consulted her clipboard with theatrical precision. "Ice accumulation on your rear steps constitutes a safety hazard according to Section 7.4 of the Meadowbrook Estates Community Guidelines. You're being fined $250. I actually laughed. I couldn't help it. "You're fining me for ice on my back steps." The steps that lead from my kitchen door to my backyard. The steps that nobody uses except me. "The rules don't specify which steps," Brenda said primly. "All walkways must be maintained in a safe condition at all times. The fine is due within 30 days, and if the violation isn't corrected within 72 hours, you'll receive an additional fine." "Brenda, those steps are in my fenced backyard. Nobody goes back there except me. I know they're slippery. I'm careful. This is ridiculous." Her face hardened. "The rules are the rules, Grant. I didn't write them, but I am responsible for enforcing them. You signed the HOA agreement when you purchased your home. Did someone actually see my back steps and complain, or are you just looking for reasons to fine people? That's none of your concern. You have your notice. Good day." She turned on her heel and marched back to her white Lexus SUV, leaving me standing in my doorway in my pajama pants, holding a violation notice for ice that existed on steps in my own private backyard. I closed the door and read the notice more carefully. Sure enough, it cited Section 7.4, which stated that all walkways, steps, and pedestrian pathways on the property must be maintained free of ice, snow accumulation, debris, or any condition that could reasonably present a safety hazard. I went to my kitchen and looked out the window at the back steps in question. There was indeed ice on them, a thin coating from where snow had melted and refrozen over the past few days. The steps led down from my kitchen door to a small patio and then to my backyard, which was entirely enclosed by a 6-foot privacy fence. No one could even see these steps unless they were in my house or in my backyard. This was insane. I'd had minor run-ins with the HOA before. The usual stuff about leaving my trash cans out an hour too long or having a package sit on my porch for 2 days. But this felt like harassment. I spent the rest of the morning fuming about it while I worked, barely able to concentrate on the code I was supposed to be debugging. Around lunchtime, I called my neighbor, Marcus Webb, who'd lived in Meadowbrook Estates for 8 years and had dealt with his share of HOA nonsense. Marcus was a high school history teacher, married with 2 kids, and one of the few people in the neighborhood I actually got along with. "They fined you for what?" Marcus said when I told him about my morning visit. "Ice on my back steps. The ones in my fenced backyard that no one can see." That's a new low, even for Brenda. Though honestly, I'm not surprised. She's been on a warpath lately. "Did you hear about the Johnsons?" "No, what happened?" "They got fined $500 because their teenage daughter had friends park on the street during her birthday party. Apparently, having more than 2 guest vehicles parked on the street for more than 4 hours violates some obscure parking rule. The Johnsons are actually talking about selling and moving." "This is getting out of control," I said. "You're telling me." "Look, my advice. Pay the fine, salt your steps, and try to stay off her radar. Fighting the HOA is like fighting City Hall, except worse because these people are your neighbors and they hold grudges." I knew Marcus was probably right, but something about the whole situation stuck in my craw. It wasn't about the money, although $250 was nothing to sneeze at. It was the principle. It was the fact that Brenda Carmichael and her HOA board thought they had the right to fine me for something that happened on my property, that affected no one but me, that no one could even see without trespassing. That afternoon, I did what any reasonable person in 2026 would do. I went down a research rabbit hole. I pulled out my copy of the HOA covenants and bylaws, all 73 pages of them, and started reading. I also looked up Ohio HOA laws, homeowner rights, and precedents for HOA overreach. What I discovered was both enlightening and infuriating. First, the covenants did technically give the HOA the right to fine homeowners for safety violations. However, the language about all walkways, steps, and pedestrian pathways was vague enough that a decent lawyer could argue it was meant to apply to publicly visible areas, not private backyard spaces. Second, Ohio law required HOAs to follow certain procedures before imposing fines, including providing written notice and an opportunity for a hearing. The notice Brenda had given me mentioned none of that. I drafted a formal response letter requesting a hearing before the HOA board to contest the fine. I cited the specific Ohio revised code sections that guaranteed my right to a hearing, and pointed out that the violation notice had failed to include information about the hearing process. I kept the tone professional but firm. I printed it out, signed it, and drove it over to Brenda's house that same evening. Brenda lived 4 streets over in one of the larger homes in the development, a colonial-style house with columns and a perfectly manicured lawn even in winter. I rang the doorbell and her husband Paul answered. Paul was a nice enough guy, a dentist who always seemed slightly embarrassed by his wife's HOA antics. "Hey, Grant," he said, looking uncomfortable. "I'm guessing this is about the violation notice." "It is. I need to give this to Brenda." "It's a formal request for a hearing." Paul winced. "She's not going to like that." "I don't particularly care," I said, probably more sharply than I should have. "I have a legal right to contest the fine." I know. Look, between you and me, I think the whole thing is ridiculous. But you know Brenda when she gets something in her head." He took the envelope. "I'll make sure she gets this." "Thanks, Paul." As I walked back to my car, I heard raised voices from inside the house. Paul had apparently mentioned what I'd delivered, and Brenda was not happy. I drove home feeling both satisfied and apprehensive. I'd stood up for myself, but I had a feeling this was only the beginning. The next morning, I woke up to find a new notice taped to my front door. This one informed me that my hearing request had been received, and that the HOA board would convene a special session on Friday evening at 6 o'clock at the community clubhouse to hear my case. The notice also included a stern reminder that failure to appear would result in the fine being automatically upheld and increased by 50%. I spent the next few days preparing for the hearing like I was getting ready for a trial. I took photographs of my back steps, my privacy fence, and the entire layout of my backyard. I printed out the relevant sections of the Ohio Revised Code. I made notes about the lack of proper notice in the original violation letter. I even walked around the neighborhood and documented several other properties that had ice on their walkways, just to show that the enforcement was selective and possibly discriminatory. Friday evening came, and I arrived at the clubhouse 15 minutes early. The Meadowbrook Estates Clubhouse was a bland beige building that hosted HOA meetings, the occasional neighborhood party, and not much else. Inside, there was a large meeting room with rows of folding chairs facing a table where the HOA board would sit. When I entered, Brenda was already there, along with the other 4 board members. Besides Brenda, the board consisted of Richard Feldman, a retired accountant who served as treasurer, Nancy Pritchard, the secretary, who was a real estate agent in her late 40s, Douglas Chen, a lawyer who worked in corporate law and always seemed to be checking his phone, and Tammy Morrison, the youngest member at 38 who owned a small marketing business. I'd had limited interactions with most of them, but none had ever struck me as particularly unreasonable. Then again, none of them had ever crossed Brenda either. "Good evening, Grant," Brenda said as I took a seat in the front row. "We'll begin shortly." A few other neighbors trickled in. I was surprised to see Marcus there, along with the Johnsons that Marcus had mentioned, and 3 or 4 other residents I recognized but didn't know well. Apparently, word had spread that someone was actually challenging an HOA fine, and people were curious. At 6 o'clock sharp, Brenda called the meeting to order. "This is a special hearing convened to address a violation notice issued to Grant Henderson of 247 Maple Drive. Mr. Henderson has requested the opportunity to contest the fine. Grant, you have 15 minutes to present your case." I stood up, my folder of documents in hand. "Thank you. I'm here because I believe the fine I received was inappropriate and possibly illegal under Ohio law. The violation notice claimed that I had ice on my rear steps, which is true. However, these steps are located in my fully fenced backyard. They're not visible from the street or any public area. The only person who uses them is me. I'm aware they're slippery and I'm careful. There is no safety hazard to anyone but myself." Brenda interrupted. "The covenant doesn't distinguish between public and private areas. It says all walkways and steps must be maintained." "Let me finish, please," I said, keeping my voice level. "The covenant's language is vague, and I believe it's intended to apply to areas that affect the community, not private spaces. But even if we accept your interpretation, the violation notice itself was deficient. Under Ohio Revised Code Section 5312.03, an HOA must provide proper written notice that includes the specific violation, the fine amount, and information about the owner's right to a hearing. Your notice mentioned none of that." I pulled out the notice and held it up. It just stated that I was fined and that I needed to correct the violation. There was no mention of my right to contest it or how to request a hearing. I only knew to request one because I researched the law myself. Douglas Chen, the lawyer, sat up straighter and reached for the copy of the notice. He read it carefully, his expression growing more serious. "She's right," he said quietly to Brenda. "This notice is deficient." Brenda's face flushed. "We've been using this format for years." That doesn't make it legal, I said. I also want to address the selective enforcement issue. I walked around the neighborhood this week and found at least 7 other properties with ice on their walkways, including visible front steps. None of them have received violations. The only way anyone could have known about the ice on my back steps is if they were in my backyard, which raises questions about trespassing. Are you accusing someone of trespassing? Brenda said sharply. I'm saying that I don't know how anyone could have seen my back steps without entering my property, yes. So my question is, who reported this violation and how did they see it? The room had gone very quiet. Nancy Pritchard, the secretary, was flipping through a binder, looking increasingly uncomfortable. Richard Feldman cleared his throat. Brenda, how did we become aware of this violation? He asked. Brenda's jaw tightened. I observed it during a routine inspection. A routine inspection of my backyard, I said. Did you enter my property without permission? I was conducting a community walkthrough to identify violations. My backyard is surrounded by a 6-foot privacy fence with a locked gate. You couldn't see those steps from outside my property. So I'll ask again. Did you enter my property without permission? The other board members were now looking at Brenda with varying expressions of surprise and concern. Douglas Chen set down his phone entirely, his lawyer instincts clearly activated. Brenda, he said carefully, did you go into Mr. Henderson's backyard? I may have looked over the fence, she said defensively. How? It's 6 feet tall, I said. I don't have to justify my methods to you. I was doing my job as HOA president. Your job doesn't include trespassing on private property, Douglas said firmly. Grant, I apologize. This is not how the board should operate. I move to dismiss the fine immediately and to revise our violation notice procedures to comply with Ohio law. Seconded, Richard said quickly. Nancy nodded. I agree. Tammy Morrison, who hadn't said a word until now, also raised her hand. Agreed. Brenda looked around the table at her fellow board members with an expression of betrayal and fury. You're all overreacting. This is a simple safety violation. No, it's not, Douglas said. It's a privacy violation, a procedural violation, and possibly a trespassing issue. The fine is dismissed. Grant again, I apologize on behalf of the board. We'll make sure this doesn't happen again. I nodded, feeling vindicated but also unsettled by the intensity of Brenda's reaction. Thank you. I appreciate the board taking this seriously. The meeting adjourned shortly after, and several neighbors came up to me to shake my hand or thank me for standing up to the HOA. Marcus clapped me on the shoulder. That was impressive, he said. You actually got them to back down. Douglas Chen did most of the heavy lifting, I said. But yeah, I'm glad I didn't just roll over. As people filed out, I noticed Brenda having a heated, whispered conversation with Nancy near the back of the room. When she saw me looking, Brenda glared at me with such venom that I actually felt a chill. This woman was not used to being contradicted, and she definitely wasn't going to forgive me for embarrassing her in front of the board and the neighbors. I drove home that night feeling like I'd won a battle, but knowing the war wasn't over. I had no idea how right I was. The retaliation started subtly. A week after the hearing, I received a new violation notice, this time for having a trash can visible from the street. Technically, my trash can was beside my garage, partially visible if you looked at the right angle. I took a photo proving that it was mostly concealed and sent a response pointing out that half the neighborhood had trash cans in similar positions. The violation was dropped, but 2 days later, I got another notice claiming my mailbox was damaged and needed repair. My mailbox was fine except for a tiny rust spot that you had to crouch down to see. I sanded it and repainted it anyway, just to avoid the hassle. Then my car got a parking ticket for being parked improperly in my own driveway, because apparently one tire was an inch over the concrete and touching the grass. I was starting to feel like I was living in a police state, but I documented everything and responded to each frivolous violation with photos and calm, professional letters. Marcus told me that Brenda was bad-mouthing me to other neighbors, claiming I was anti-community and making it difficult for the HOA to maintain standards. A few neighbors I barely knew started giving me cold shoulders at the mailbox. But I also heard from several others who were grateful that someone was finally pushing back against what they saw as HOA overreach. The Johnsons invited me over for dinner and told me their stories about the birthday party fine, which had indeed cost them $500 and which they'd paid rather than fight because they didn't want the stress. "We've lived here 6 years," Mrs. Johnson said. Her name was Patricia. "The first 4 were fine, but ever since Brenda became president 2 years ago, it's been non-stop. Every little thing is a violation. It's like she goes around with a magnifying glass looking for reasons to fine people." "You know how she became president?" I asked. Mr. Johnson, whose first name was Leonard, shrugged. "She ran unopposed. The previous president, nice guy named Tom Berkeley, moved away and nobody else wanted the job. Most people don't pay attention to HOA elections. They just ignore the ballots or vote for whoever's name is on there. So she basically got the position by default," I said. "Pretty much. And once she had it, she packed the board with people she thought would go along with her. Except it looks like some of them are starting to have second thoughts after what happened at your hearing." That gave me an idea. HOA board elections were coming up in April, just 2 months away. The terms for 3 of the 5 board positions were expiring, including Brenda's presidency. What if people who were tired of the constant harassment actually ran for the board? What if we could vote Brenda out? I mentioned the idea to Marcus, who loved it. "I'd run myself if I had the time," he said. "But with teaching and coaching the debate team, I'm swamped. You should run, though." "Me? I don't know anything about running an HOA. Neither does Brenda, apparently, except how to find people." "Come on, Grant. You've already proven you can stand up to her. Other people would vote for you." "Let me think about it," I said. Over the next week, I did think about it a lot. I'd never been particularly civic-minded or interested in community leadership. But the more I considered it, the more I realized that someone needed to provide an alternative to Brenda's reign of petty tyranny. I started talking to neighbors, feeling out whether there would be support for a challenge slate. The response was overwhelmingly positive. At least a dozen people told me they'd vote for anyone who ran against Brenda. I also learned more about the HOA's finances, which were technically public record. I requested copies of the budget and financial statements from Richard Feldman, the treasurer, who seemed relieved that someone was actually interested in the numbers. Most people don't care until it's time to complain about the dues going up. Richard told me when I stopped by his house to pick up the documents. He was a meticulous man in his late 60s with reading glasses on a chain and a basement office that looked like it belonged to an accountant from 1975. "I just want to understand where the money goes," I said. "Good luck." I've been trying to get the rest of the board to pay attention to the finances for a year. Brenda spends money like water and nobody questions it. That was interesting. "What do you mean?" Richard hesitated, clearly torn between discretion and frustration. Finally, he sighed and pulled out a different folder. "Look, I probably shouldn't show you this, but you seem like someone who actually cares about doing things right. Take a look at the expenses over the past 18 months. I sat down and started going through the statements. What I saw was alarming. The HOA had spent thousands of dollars on consulting fees to a company called Prestige Management Solutions. There were regular charges for community enhancement that weren't itemized. There were payments for landscaping services that seemed excessive given the actual amount of common area we had. "What's Prestige Management Solutions?" I asked. "I have no idea," Richard said. "I've asked Brenda multiple times, and she says they're consultants who help with compliance and management. But I've never seen any reports from them, and I don't know what they actually do. This is like $15,000 over 18 months. Yep, and the landscaping charges. We don't have that much common area. Most of the development is private property. We've got the entrance, the clubhouse grounds, and maybe an acre of green space total, but we're paying like we've got a golf course. Has anyone else on the board noticed this? I've brought it up in meetings." Brenda always has an explanation, and Nancy backs her up. Douglas doesn't pay attention to the financial reports, and Tammy just goes along with whatever the majority says. I'm one voice and I'm outvoted. I looked at Richard carefully. "Would you be willing to talk about this publicly if it came to that?" He met my eyes. "If you're thinking about running for the board, yes. Someone needs to audit this properly. I've been doing my best, but I don't have access to all the accounts. Brenda keeps some things separate, says it's for security. That doesn't sound right. It's not. An HOA treasurer should have full access to all accounts, but when I pushed on it, she threatened to have me removed from the board for failing to fulfill my duties, so I backed off. I'm retiring to Florida in 6 months anyway, and I didn't want the headache. I left Richard's house with a heavy folder of financial documents and a growing sense that the ice on my back steps had been just the tip of an iceberg. That evening, I spread everything out on my dining room table and started going through it line by line. I might be a software engineer, not an accountant, but I knew how to spot patterns and anomalies in data, and there were a lot of anomalies here. The Prestige Management Solutions charges happened like clockwork, usually around $2,000 every 2 months. I tried looking up the company online and found nothing. No website, no business registration I could find, nothing. The landscaping charges came from a company called Greenscape Services. I called them the next day, pretending to be a homeowner interested in their services. "Greenscape, this is Mike," a friendly voice answered. "Hi, my name's Grant. I live in Meadowbrook Estates in Columbus, and I understand you do our HOA landscaping. I wanted to ask about getting some additional work done on my personal property." "Meadowbrook Estates? Hang on, let me check," I heard typing. That's weird. I don't see you guys in our system." "You sure you got the right company? Your name is on our HOA financial statements. Greenscape Services." "Yeah, that's us. But I'm looking at our active contracts and I don't see Meadowbrook Estates. When did we supposedly start working for your HOA?" "According to these records, about 18 months ago." More typing. "Okay, this is strange. I do see some invoices under that name, but they're not for HOA work. They are for a residential property at, let me see, 418 Windermere Court. Is that the HOA address?" "No," I said slowly. "That's a residential address in the neighborhood. Do you know whose property?" "I can't really give out client information, but if you're seeing charges on HOA statements, something's not right. You might want to talk to whoever handles your HOA finances." I thanked him and hung up, my heart pounding. I looked up 418 Windermere Court in the neighborhood directory. It was Brenda Carmichael's address. The HOA was being charged for landscaping work done at Brenda's personal residence. I sat back in my chair, my mind racing. This wasn't just petty tyranny or overzealous rule enforcement. This was fraud. Brenda was using HOA funds to pay for her personal landscaping and hiding it as a community expense. And if she was doing that, what else was she stealing? I needed to be careful here. I couldn't just go around accusing the HOA president of embezzlement without solid proof. I needed more evidence, and I probably needed a lawyer. I thought about Douglas Chen, the board member who was an attorney, but I didn't know him well enough to trust him. He might feel obligated to warn Brenda. Instead, I called an attorney I'd used once before for a contract review, a sharp woman named Rachel Torres who specialized in property law. I explained the situation, and she agreed to meet with me the next day. Rachel's office was in downtown Columbus, a modern building with glass walls and exposed brick. She was in her early 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a professional bun, and an air of competence that immediately put me at ease. "So you think your HOA president is embezzling?" she said, after I'd laid out everything I'd found. "I think she's definitely fraudulently charging the HOA for personal expenses. Whether there's more, I don't know yet." Rachel flipped through the documents I'd brought. "This is pretty damning, especially the landscaping charges. The consulting fees are harder to prove without knowing what Prestige Management Solutions actually is, but the pattern is suspicious. Have you considered that she might own that company?" I tried to look it up but couldn't find anything. Limited liability companies can be tricky to trace, especially if they're registered under a slightly different name or in a different state. Let me do some digging. She made some notes. "Here's what I recommend. First, you should report this to the rest of the HOA board. They have a fiduciary duty to investigate financial irregularities. Second, if the board doesn't take appropriate action, you and other homeowners can file a complaint with the Ohio Attorney General's office. They have a division that handles HOA disputes and fraud. Third, you might want to consider running for the board yourself to get direct access to the accounts." "I've been thinking about that," I said. "Good. In the meantime, document everything. Don't confront Brenda directly. If she knows you're onto her, she'll destroy evidence. And Grant, be careful. People who steal tens of thousands of dollars don't usually react well to being caught." I left Rachel's office with a plan, but also with a knot of anxiety in my stomach. This had escalated way beyond a stupid fine for ice on my back steps. I was now investigating potential embezzlement by someone who already seemed to have it out for me. That weekend, I reached out to Douglas Chen through email, keeping my message vague, but requesting a private meeting about concerns regarding HOA finances. To my surprise, he responded within an hour and invited me to his house that evening. Douglas lived in one of the nicer homes in the development, a modern build with clean lines and a meticulously organized interior. His home office, where we met, had floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with legal texts and a desk that looked like it cost more than my car. "I'm glad you reached out," Douglas said after we'd settled into chairs. "I've been concerned about Brenda's management for a while, but haven't had concrete evidence of any wrongdoing. What have you found?" I walked him through everything: the landscaping charges, the mysterious consulting fees, and Richard's concerns about limited access to accounts. Douglas listened intently, his expression growing grimmer. "This is serious," he said when I finished. "If what you're saying is accurate, and I have no reason to doubt you, Brenda has committed fraud and breached her fiduciary duty. As board members, we're all potentially liable if we don't act on this information. What do you recommend?" "We need to call an emergency board meeting. Richard should be there since he's the treasurer. Nancy, too, though I suspect she might be involved or at least complicit. Tammy, I'm not sure about, but we need a majority to vote on hiring an independent auditor. Will Brenda agree to that?" She doesn't have a choice. According to our bylaws, any 3 board members can call an emergency meeting. With you bringing this information to me and Richard already concerned, we have grounds. I'll handle the legal aspects. We scheduled the emergency meeting for the following Thursday evening. Douglas agreed to formally request it, citing urgent financial matters requiring board attention. Brenda tried to push back, I heard later, but Douglas invoked the bylaws and made it clear that the meeting was happening with or without her cooperation. In the days leading up to the meeting, I continued my investigation. Rachel Torres called me with interesting news. She'd tracked down Prestige Management Solutions. It was indeed a limited liability company registered in Delaware, and the registered agent was one Paul Carmichael, Brenda's husband. So she created a fake company and has been billing the HOA for non-existent consulting services, Rachel said. That's textbook embezzlement. I'd estimate, based on the documents you showed me, she's stolen at least $30,000 over 18 months, probably more if we could see all the accounts. Her husband's involved too. At minimum, he allowed his name to be used. Depending on what he knew, he could be charged as an accomplice. This is beyond civil fraud, Grant. This is criminal. Thursday evening arrived and I showed up at the clubhouse 30 minutes early. Richard was already there, looking nervous but determined. Douglas arrived shortly after, carrying a briefcase full of documents. Nancy showed up right at the meeting time, glancing around suspiciously. Tammy came in looking confused, clearly not understanding why an emergency meeting had been called. Brenda was the last to arrive, and she was furious. Her face was flushed, her jaw set in a hard line. She slammed her purse down on the table and glared at Douglas. "This better be good," she snapped. "I had to cancel plans for this ridiculous emergency meeting." "It's very good," Douglas said calmly. "Or rather, very bad, depending on your perspective. Grant, would you like to present what you found?" I stood up, my folder in hand, and walked the board through everything. The landscaping charges that actually went to Brenda's house, the fake consulting company registered to her husband, the excessive and unexplained expenses, and the pattern of financial irregularities that Richard had been flagging for months. With each revelation, Brenda's face went from red to white to red again. Nancy looked shocked and kept glancing at Brenda as if expecting her to deny everything. Tammy's mouth hung open. Richard nodded along, clearly relieved that the information was finally coming to light. "This is slander," Brenda said when I finished. "You have no proof of any of this. You're making wild accusations because you're still angry about that violation notice." "I have proof," I said, pulling out the phone records from Greenscape Services, the LLC registration documents for Prestige Management Solutions, and annotated copies of the HOA financial statements. "I've spoken to the landscaping company. They confirmed that the charges billed to the HOA were actually for work done at your residence, and Prestige Management Solutions is registered to your husband." Douglas stood up. "Brenda, these are serious allegations. The board has a duty to investigate them. I'm moving that we immediately suspend your access to HOA accounts and hire an independent auditor to review all finances for the past 3 years. Second, we should consult with legal counsel about potential criminal implications." "I second the motion," Richard said quickly. "Wait," Nancy said. "Shouldn't Brenda have a chance to explain?" "By all means," Douglas said. "Brenda, would you like to explain why HOA funds were used to pay for landscaping at your personal residence?" Brenda stood up, grabbing her purse. "I don't have to explain anything to you. This is a witch hunt. Grant has been trying to undermine me ever since I rightfully issued him a violation. Now he's fabricated evidence and convinced you all to turn on me. I'm done with this. You want to audit the finances? Fine. You won't find anything wrong. Then you won't mind if we proceed with the vote, Douglas said. I'm leaving. You can all go to hell. Brenda stormed out of the clubhouse, leaving the 4 remaining board members and me sitting in stunned silence. Well, Tammy said finally, I guess that's a confession if I ever heard one. Douglas called the vote. It was unanimous. The board suspended Brenda's access to all HOA accounts and authorized Douglas to hire both an independent auditor and a criminal defense attorney to advise them. Douglas also agreed to reach out to the Ohio Attorney General's office to report the suspected fraud. As we were packing up to leave, Richard pulled me aside. Thank you, he said quietly. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't have the courage to really push it. You did. I just wanted to fight a stupid fine about ice on my back steps, I said. I had no idea it would lead to this. That's how it always starts, Richard said. Small abuses of power lead to bigger ones if nobody stands up. I drove home that night feeling exhausted but also strangely energized. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Brenda would fight back, and there would probably be legal battles ahead. But at least the truth was coming out. The neighborhood grapevine went into overdrive over the next few days. Word spread about the emergency board meeting and the allegations against Brenda. Some people were shocked. Others said they'd suspected something was off. And a few die-hard Brenda supporters insisted it was all a misunderstanding or a conspiracy. Brenda herself was lying low, not responding to calls or emails from other board members or neighbors. The independent auditor, a stern woman named Patricia Yao from a reputable accounting firm, started her work the following week. She had full access to every account, every receipt, and every financial record. Douglas reported to the rest of the board that Patricia had already found significant irregularities and that her preliminary assessment suggested fraud in excess of $50,000. $50,000. I said when Douglas called to update me. I thought it was around 30. That was just what you could see from the documents Richard had. Patricia found a separate account that Brenda controlled, supposedly for capital improvements. Most of the money in it went to vendors that either don't exist or provided services to Brenda's personal property, not HOA property. There's also evidence of kickback schemes with a couple of legitimate vendors. This is so much worse than I thought. It gets worse. The attorney I consulted said we need to file a police report. This is felony-level embezzlement. The board is meeting tomorrow to vote on whether to authorize me to contact the Columbus Police Department. I think it's going to be unanimous. What about Nancy? She was Brenda's ally. Nancy's cooperating fully with the audit. She claims she had no idea about any of the fraud, that she just rubber-stamped what Brenda told her. I'm not sure I entirely believe that, but Patricia hasn't found evidence that Nancy profited from any of it, so it might just be willful ignorance rather than active participation. The board voted to authorize the police report, and Douglas filed it the next day. Within a week, 2 detectives from the Columbus Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit came to the clubhouse to interview board members and review the audit findings. I gave a statement as well, explaining how I'd stumbled onto the fraud while researching HOA finances. Detective Sarah Mullins, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, seemed particularly interested in the Prestige Management Solutions charges. These fake vendor schemes are pretty common, she said. Someone in a position of trust creates a shell company, bills their organization for fake services, and pockets the money. We see it with nonprofits, small businesses, and HOAs. The problem is proving criminal intent and tracing where the money went. The auditor found over $50,000 in fraudulent charges, I said. Oh, we'll get her, Detective Mullins said confidently. It just takes time to build the case properly. We need bank records, we need to trace the money, and we need to make sure everything's documented in a way that will hold up in court. But between what you found and what the auditor's turning up, this is a solid case. About 2 weeks after the police report was filed, Brenda hired an attorney, a slick-looking guy named Martin Voss, who immediately went on the offensive. He sent a letter to the HOA board threatening to sue for defamation and wrongful removal, claiming that Brenda had done nothing wrong, and that the allegations were part of a coordinated campaign to destroy her reputation. He also sent me a personal cease and desist letter demanding that I stop spreading false and malicious statements about his client. I forwarded the letter to Rachel Torres, who laughed. "This is standard intimidation tactics," she said. "He's trying to scare you into backing down. Don't. Everything you've said is supported by documentary evidence. Truth is an absolute defense to defamation. Let me draft a response." Rachel's response was a masterpiece of lawyerly language that basically said, "Prove it." She pointed out that I had made no public statements about Brenda beyond providing evidence to the HOA board and law enforcement, and that I would be happy to repeat every allegation in court under oath because I could prove all of it. Martin Voss never responded. The HOA board elections in April took on a whole new significance. Douglas announced that he was running for president. Richard, despite his plans to move to Florida, agreed to stay on as treasurer through the end of the year to help stabilize the finances. I decided to run for one of the open board seats, as did 3 other neighbors: Marcus Webb, Patricia Johnson, and a retired engineer named Stephanie Lang who'd lived in the neighborhood for a decade. Brenda, surprisingly, also filed to run for re-election. Her campaign, such as it was, consisted of leaving flyers on doorsteps claiming she'd been the victim of a political coup, and that the allegations against her were lies spread by people who hated accountability. Most neighbors threw the flyers away, but a few people apparently believed her, or at least wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt. The election was held on a Saturday in mid-April at the clubhouse. Turnout was massive, nearly 3/4 of the homeowners in the development, compared to the usual 15 or 20%. People were invested in this election in a way they'd never been before. When the votes were counted, it was a landslide. Douglas won the presidency with 82% of the vote. I won one of the board seats with 76%. Marcus and Stephanie won the other 2 open seats. Brenda received only 18% of the vote, a humiliating defeat that effectively ended any lingering influence she had in the neighborhood. I saw her briefly after the results were announced. She was standing alone near the exit, her face a mask of barely suppressed rage. For a moment our eyes met, and I saw something in her expression that was almost frightening, a mix of hatred and disbelief that anyone had dared to challenge her and win. "You'll regret this," she said quietly as I walked past. "I don't think I will," I replied and kept walking. The new board's first order of business was implementing reforms to prevent future abuse. We revised the financial procedures to require multiple sign-offs on any expense over $500, gave the treasurer full access to all accounts, and instituted quarterly financial reviews by an independent auditor. We also rewrote the violation notice procedures to comply with Ohio law, requiring proper written notice with information about hearing rights for any fine over $100. Douglas, as the new president, was committed to running the HOA transparently and fairly. "Our job is to maintain common areas and protect property values," he said at our first official board meeting. "It's not to micromanage people's lives or shake them down for money. If we do this right, people should barely notice the HOA exists." Meanwhile, the criminal case against Brenda was moving forward. In June, she and her husband Paul were formally indicted on multiple counts of theft, fraud, and forgery. The prosecutor's case was built on the audit findings. Bank records showing that money from the fake vendor payments had gone into personal accounts controlled by Brenda and Paul, and testimony from several legitimate vendors who admitted they'd given Brenda kickbacks in exchange for lucrative HOA contracts. The total amount of the theft was ultimately calculated at $73,000 over a 3-year period. Brenda had been skimming money almost from the moment she became HOA president. The trial was scheduled for September, but Brenda's attorney negotiated a plea deal in August. Brenda pleaded guilty to theft in office and fraud, both felonies. In exchange for her cooperation and agreement to make full restitution, she received a sentence of 3 years in prison followed by 2 years of probation. Paul pleaded guilty to being an accessory after the fact and received 2 years of probation and a suspended jail sentence, though he also had to pay restitution. The restitution was key. Brenda and Paul had to sell their house in Meadowbrook Estates to repay the HOA. They also had to liquidate other assets, including a vacation condo in Hilton Head that apparently had been purchased in part with stolen HOA funds. The HOA ultimately recovered about $60,000 of the stolen money, which the board voted to use for long overdue repairs to the clubhouse and improvements to the common areas. In October, I attended Brenda's sentencing hearing. I wasn't required to be there, but I felt like I needed to see it through. The courtroom was half full with neighbors, some there to support the prosecution and others, surprisingly, there to support Brenda. Paul sat in the front row, looking like he'd aged 10 years in the past 6 months. Brenda, standing before the judge, looked diminished somehow. The imperious, self-righteous woman who'd shown up at my door to find me for ice on my back steps was gone, replaced by someone who looked tired and defeated. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Angela Reynolds, didn't mince words. "Miss Carmichael, you held a position of trust in your community, and you abused that trust systematically and deliberately for years. You stole from your neighbors, people who relied on you to act in their best interests. The amount involved qualifies this as felony theft, and the fact that you went to such lengths to conceal your actions demonstrates that you knew what you were doing was wrong. I'm accepting the plea agreement, but I want you to understand that you're receiving a significant amount of leniency. Many defendants with your level of criminal conduct would receive much longer sentences." Brenda nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I can't undo what I did, but I am genuinely sorry." "You'll have 3 years in prison to reflect on that," Judge Reynolds said. Brenda was remanded into custody immediately. As the bailiff led her out of the courtroom in handcuffs, she glanced back once at Paul, who was sobbing quietly. She didn't look at anyone else, including me. After the hearing, several neighbors gathered outside the courthouse, processing what had just happened. Patricia Johnson, who'd become a friend over the past few months, shook her head in amazement. "I can't believe it started with her fining you for ice on your back steps," she said. "Neither can I admitted. "If she just left me alone, I never would have looked into the finances and she might still be getting away with it." "That's how these things work, though," Marcus said. "People who abuse power in big ways usually start with small abuses." "She thought she was untouchable, so she got sloppy." "I'm just glad it's over," I said, but of course it wasn't quite over. There were still loose ends to tie up. Nancy Pritchard resigned from the HOA board in November, citing the stress of the scandal even though she'd never been charged with any crime. The board appointed a neighbor named Louis Ortega to fill her seat. Tammy Morrison proved to be an excellent board member, detail-oriented and fair, and I was glad we'd kept her on. The HOA continued to function smoothly under Douglas's leadership. Violation notices decreased dramatically. Instead of nitpicking every tiny infraction, the board focused on legitimate issues that affected the community's appearance and safety. People actually started enjoying living in Meadowbrook Estates again. As for me, I served out my term on the board and actually ran for re-election the following year. I found that I enjoyed the work when it was done fairly and transparently. I helped implement a new online system for homeowners to submit maintenance requests and pay dues, which streamlined communication and reduced misunderstandings. I also met someone, a woman named Olivia Kim, who'd moved into the neighborhood during all the chaos and had heard about the HOA scandal from neighbors. She was a data analyst, sharp and funny, and we bonded over our shared appreciation for systems and processes actually working the way they're supposed to. By the following spring, we were dating seriously, and she eventually moved in with me. One evening about a year after Brenda's sentencing, Olivia and I were sitting on my back patio, enjoying the warm weather. She glanced at the steps leading down from the kitchen door, the steps that had started everything. "You know what's funny?" she said. "I don't think I've ever seen ice on those steps." "It's June," I pointed out. "No, I mean, even in winter. You're really good about salting them," I laughed. "Yeah, well, I learned my lesson about leaving them icy, though I'd argue I was always careful even before all this." "Do you ever regret how everything went down? I mean, you could have just paid the fine and moved on." I thought about that. The past year and a half had been stressful, time-consuming, and at times frightening. I'd made enemies, spent money on lawyers, and devoted hundreds of hours to HOA business that I never expected to be involved in. "No," I said finally. "I don't regret it. What Brenda was doing was wrong, not just the stealing but the whole culture of harassment and intimidation. If I hadn't pushed back, she'd still be doing it, and she'd probably have stolen even more money. Sometimes you have to stand up for what's right, even when it's inconvenient." "That's very noble of you," Olivia said, leaning against my shoulder. "I don't know about noble. Stubborn, maybe." "Stubbornly noble. I'll take it." I kissed the top of her head and looked out at the backyard, my private space that had somehow become the catalyst for exposing corruption and fraud. The ice was long gone, replaced by summer flowers and green grass. The privacy fence still stood, marking the boundaries of my property, a reminder that some things should remain private and that authority has limits. Living in a homeowners association would probably always involve some level of annoyance and bureaucracy. That was just the nature of shared governance. But it didn't have to involve abuse or corruption, and it definitely didn't have to involve petty tyrants using their positions to harass and steal from their neighbors. The new HOA board was proof that things could be different. We weren't perfect, and we still had disagreements about policies and priorities. But we treated residents with respect, followed proper procedures, and managed the community's money honestly. Violation notices were rare and only issued for legitimate issues. The clubhouse was renovated and actually got used for community events. Property values increased not because of aggressive enforcement, but because people wanted to live in a neighborhood that was well managed and fair. I eventually served 3 terms on the HOA board before deciding I'd done my part and it was time to let others step up. By then, Meadowbrook Estates had a reputation as one of the better-run HOA communities in Columbus, a place where the rules made sense and the people in charge actually cared about the residents. Brenda served her full 3 years in prison and was released in late 2029. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she and Paul had divorced while she was incarcerated and that she'd moved to another state to start over. I never saw her again, and I was fine with that. She'd paid her debt to society and made restitution to the HOA. I had no interest in revenge or rubbing her face in what had happened. It was enough that justice had been served and that the community had healed. Looking back on the whole experience years later, I sometimes marvel at how a simple violation notice about ice on my back steps had led to such a complicated and consequential chain of events. If Brenda had been reasonable, if she'd focused on actual community issues instead of nitpicking private matters, none of it would have happened. She'd still be living in her nice house. Paul would still have his dental practice thriving without the stigma of a criminal conviction, and I'd still be the guy who mostly kept to himself and didn't get involved in neighborhood politics. But that's not how it played out. Brenda's overreach led me to dig deeper, which exposed her corruption, which led to criminal charges, which led to prison time and financial ruin. All because she couldn't leave well enough alone and had to fine me for something that affected no one but myself. There's probably a lesson in there about proportionality and knowing when to mind your own business. There's definitely a lesson about the importance of transparency and accountability in any organization, even something as mundane as a homeowners association. And there's absolutely a lesson about standing up for yourself when someone in authority tries to push you around, even if it's uncomfortable, and even if it leads to complications you never anticipated. I'm glad I stood up to that violation notice. I'm glad I didn't just pay the fine and move on. Because in the end, it wasn't really about the ice or the steps or the $250. It was about principle and fairness and refusing to let someone abuse their power just because they thought they could get away with it. My back steps are clear and safe now, summer or winter. The HOA is well run and honest. The neighborhood is a genuinely pleasant place to live. And I learned that sometimes the smallest acts of resistance can lead to the biggest changes, that speaking up matters, and that even in the face of petty tyranny, ordinary people can make a difference if they're willing to try. That's worth a lot more than $250, and a lot more than the ice that melted from those steps years ago.